Ladies, can we talk tonight? Not surface level talk, but real talk. The kind that touches the places in your soul you don't always let people see, because I know some of you have been there. That moment when the silence gets loud, when he leaves and you're left with nothing but questions and a phone that doesn't ring. But then he comes back. And if you're not careful, you'll think his return is confirmation of your worth. You'll think it means you're finally enough. But sis, what if I told you that his return doesn't validate you? It exposes him. It reveals what your healing, your growth, your peace did in his absence. Listen, we got to talk about this not just from a relationship perspective, but from a spiritual one, because sometimes when people walk away, it's not rejection, it's redirection. And when they come back, it's not always a blessing. It might just be a test. But I came to remind somebody tonight, you are not the woman you used to be when he left. When someone walks away from you, especially someone you care deeply for, it's natural to go through a whirlwind of emotions, confusion, sadness, anger, and that unspoken but deeply felt question, was I not enough? We start measuring our worth through the lens of someone else's departure. We replay conversations, dissect every message, overanalyze every silence, and wonder what we could have done differently. And when that person comes back after a season of no contact, it's easy to mistake their return as proof that we've somehow won their attention back, their interest, maybe even their love. But the truth is, someone's return is not a measure of your value. It's not a stamp of approval or a sign that you finally become worthy in their eyes. That return often says more about them than it does about you. It might reflect their confusion, their loneliness, or their realization of what they lost, but it does not define your identity. What defines you is your growth, your healing, the woman you became while they were gone, because during that silence, while your heart was breaking, something powerful was happening underneath the surface. In the stillness, you were being stretched. In the emptiness, you were being filled with something new, self-respect, clarity, and maybe even purpose. You began to learn that your worth wasn't in how quickly someone texted back, how often they called, or how consistent their attention was. Your worth started to be rooted in something deeper, something unshakable. That growth may have looked like quiet mornings when you made your coffee without crying. It may have looked like unfollowing him, not out of spite, but out of strength. It may have shown up in late night journal entries, therapy sessions, or long talks with God where you begged for understanding, but found peace instead. Your growth didn't come wrapped in a pretty packet. It came through pain, through letting go, through sitting with the ache of absence and not rushing to fill it with temporary comfort. And that process, that transformation, that's where your validation lives. You see, sometimes a man comes back not because he sees your new light, but because he remembers the access he used to have. He remembers the version of you that said yes when she should have said no. The woman who loved him through red flags, who gave grace beyond reason, who showed up even when he didn't ask her to. But what he doesn't know is that the woman he left is not the woman who's standing here today. The silence changed you, the space taught you, and now his return isn't a welcome sign, it's a wake-up call. This is the part they don't talk about, that sometimes people return not because they've grown, but because they expect you haven't. And if you're not rooted in your healing, you might mistake his reappearance as fate instead of recognizing it as familiarity. He might come back with apologies, with charm, with soft words and sweet memories. And if your growth isn't solid, you'll fall for potential instead of standing in your power. But sis, your growth was never about getting him back. It was about getting you back. The real you. The one who doesn't settle for bare minimum, who doesn't confuse inconsistency with mystery, who doesn't wait for someone else to decide she's valuable. When you start to grow, when you start to really evolve, you realize that peace is more attractive than passion that leaves you in pieces. You learn that presence isn't enough, it has to be purposeful. that love without respect isn't love at all. And that's why his return can't be your validation. Because if your worth rises and falls with his attention, you'll always be on shaky ground. One missed call will ruin your day. One bad message will make you spiral. One unanswered question will leave you restless. But when your worth is rooted in your growth, you can greet his return with clarity instead of confusion. It's okay to remember what you had. It's okay to feel a mix of emotions. Healing doesn't erase your memories. It just changes how they affect you. But your growth gives you the discernment to ask better questions. Not does he want me back, but is this still aligned with who I'm becoming? Not why did he leave, but why did I stay so long? And definitely not what if he's changed, but have I changed enough to know what I now deserve? This is where your power lies, in your ability to see the difference between history and destiny. Just because someone returns doesn't mean they're meant to stay. Sometimes their comeback is just closure in disguise. Sometimes it's life's way of checking if you really learned the lesson, because people always feel the shift in you when you heal. They may not have noticed your pain, but they'll notice your peace. They may not have respected your boundaries before, but now they sense the difference. The energy is no longer open access. The invitation has expired. You didn't become cold, you became clear. And if he comes back and sees the change in you, that's not your cue to shrink back into who you used to be just to keep him comfortable. That's your cue to stand tall in your transformation, because you didn't go through all that heartbreak, all that soul searching just to go back to square one. You didn't fight through your loneliness just to trade it in for confusion again. You didn't spend nights praying for direction just to end up in the same cycle with the same person. The return isn't the prize, your healing is. The glow up wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, emotional, mental. And that version of you deserves someone who sees it, respects it, and mirrors it. So let his return be a reminder, not a reward. A reminder of how far you've come, of how much you've grown, of how you no longer wait for someone else to see your value, because you've already seen it for yourself. You are the validation. You are the breakthrough. You are the change. His return didn't make you whole. You were already on your way. You're not the woman who waits to be chosen. You're the woman who chooses herself. And that right there is where your real power lives. There's a strange kind of clarity that only shows up when the noise dies down, when the calls stop, when the texts no longer come through, when the attention you once relied on fades into absence. You find yourself face to face with the one thing many people avoid at all costs: silence. Silence is not just the absence of sound, it's the presence of truth. It's what settles in when distractions are removed, when emotional noise quiets down, and when the space someone else used to occupy becomes a mirror instead of a memory. And in that mirror, you begin to see things you couldn't or wouldn't see before. Not because the truth suddenly arrived, but because now, finally, you're still enough to notice it. When someone is in your life, especially someone who keeps you emotionally occupied, whether through love, confusion, excitement, or even chaos, their presence can cloud your ability to see clearly. Their actions might be inconsistent, their words vague, but you brush it off because at least they're there, at least they're reaching out, at least you're not being ignored. But presence without clarity is a trap. Just because someone is around doesn't mean they're committed. Just because someone is calling doesn't mean they're connected. Just because someone hasn't left doesn't mean they're truly invested. Sometimes their presence is simply a form of control, a way of keeping you close enough to feed their ego, but far enough to avoid responsibility. And when you're emotionally attached, it's easy to mistake proximity for intimacy. But when they go silent, when the messages stop and the presence fades, what's left is you, just you, your thoughts, and the reality that had been trying to reach you all along. You begin to replay things that didn't sit right, but you ignored. You remember conversations where their words didn't match their actions. You finally admit how often you justified what didn't make sense. Silence, it doesn't pretend, it doesn't perform, it simply reveals. It pulls back the curtain on all the things you couldn't confront while you were still emotionally entangled. And while it may feel like rejection, silence is often protection in disguise, because without it, you may have stayed stuck in a cycle where confusion was normalized and your needs were secondary. Silence also reveals something deeper, not just about them, but about you, about your triggers, your fears, your patterns. It exposes the part of you that equated love with availability, even when that availability lacked sincerity. It brings to the surface your tendency to hold on tighter when someone pulls away. It shows you how much of your worth was tied to someone else's attention. And though it may be painful, this revelation is a gift, because you can't heal what you don't acknowledge. You can't grow past what you refuse to see. The silence is the space where you stop pretending, where the performance ends, where the truth steps in and whispers, now that they're gone, can you finally hear me? Sometimes the presence of someone in your life is so loud, it drowns out the voice of your own intuition, that gut feeling that said something wasn't right, that quiet knowing that you deserved more. But when they disappear, that voice gets louder. It starts asking real questions. Why did you settle for almost? Why did you ignore your boundaries? Why were you afraid to ask for what you really wanted? The silence becomes sacred. It becomes a sanctuary where the noise of emotional inconsistency is replaced by the wisdom of inner clarity. You start to see patterns. You realize it wasn't just about him. It was about your relationship with yourself. Because if someone could keep you in confusion that long, if someone could disappear and reappear and still have access to your heart, there's a deeper issue to confront. And that confrontation doesn't happen in noise. It doesn't happen in arguments or in closure conversations. It happens in the quiet moments where you finally stop trying to fix, to chase, to earn, and instead you sit with yourself and feel the weight of what was never yours to carry. Silence reveals how heavy it's been, how tired you are, how much you've poured out without being poured into. This is the truth presence often tries to hide, because when someone is in your life, especially someone who hasn't done the work on themselves, their presence can be manipulative. It can create emotional noise that keeps you from noticing how empty the connection actually is. They might give you just enough to keep you hoping, but not enough to build anything real. They might speak about potential while never taking real steps toward partnership. And as long as they're there, part of you holds on, afraid to let go because you've made their presence a lifeline. But the absence is what sets you free, because when the noise stops, so does the illusion. When they're not texting, you're not distracted. When they're not calling, you're not anxious trying to decode their words. You begin to recalibrate, to feel your own emotions instead of absorbing theirs. You begin to question the version of love you accepted and why you accepted it. You stop seeing their silence as punishment and start recognizing it as space for your transformation. You stop interpreting their withdrawal as your failure and start understanding it as an opportunity for clarity. And when that clarity comes, it doesn't always bring comfort. Sometimes it hurts. It hurts to admit you were hoping they'd change, that you were waiting on a version of them they never promised to become, that you were willing to overlook things that deep down you knew would break you later. But even in that hurt, there's freedom. Because you finally stop trying to rewrite the past and start accepting it for what it was. The silence taught you what their presence never could, what you truly need, what you deeply desire, and what you absolutely will no longer tolerate. You may have thought their presence was keeping you whole, but really it was keeping you distracted. And now that the silence has settled in, you see things clearly. You realize that peace feels different than the emotional roller coaster you were on. that real love doesn't confuse you, that respect is non-negotiable, and that when someone truly sees your value, they show up not just with their words, but with their consistency, their effort, their integrity. Silence doesn't lie. It just gives you the space to finally tell yourself the truth. There's something strange that happens when you start healing. When you begin to set boundaries you never had before, when you start telling yourself the truth instead of repeating old stories written in pain, when you stop blaming yourself for the things that broke you and start learning how to live beyond survival mode. Healing doesn't just change your mindset, it changes your energy. It shifts the way you walk into rooms, the way you respond to disrespect, the way you protect your peace. Healing transforms your inner world, but there's something most people don't talk about: what you attract while you're healing, especially what you start to attract back. Because healing doesn't just invite new things into your life. Sometimes it reattracts old things, past relationships, former friends, people you thought you were done with, energies you've outgrown. At first, it might seem confusing. You've done so much work. You've cried, journaled, gone to therapy, prayed, fasted, and fought your way back to yourself. So why does the past feel like it's knocking on your door again? Why does someone you thought you were finally over show back up in your DMs, in your dreams, or in your memory at the most inconvenient moment? It's not always a sign to reopen the door. Sometimes it's a sign that your healing is working, that you've shifted so much. The past wants to see if it still has access to you. It wants to test if you'll still answer to the same name, still react the same way, still entertain the same patterns. But the woman you are now doesn't sit at tables where her peace is the price. The version of you that exists post-healing isn't interested in repeating lessons that almost destroyed her. That's why certain people come back, not because they've changed, but because they feel the difference in you. Your energy has shifted. You don't chase anymore. You don't beg for clarity. You're no longer waiting for someone to choose you. You've already chosen yourself. And when you operate from that place, people who used to benefit from your brokenness start to feel that disconnection. They don't recognize the version of you that says no without guilt, that doesn't respond to breadcrumbs with open arms, that isn't moved by the same emotional games that once worked like clockwork. What you're attracting back is a reflection of who you used to be, not who you are now. And that gap between the old you and the healed you becomes painfully obvious when the past tries to re-enter. You start to notice how small the conversations feel, how forced the connection seems, how you're no longer excited by the potential. You're now focused on the reality. You're not looking for butterflies anymore. You're looking for peace. You're not drawn to inconsistency masked as passion. You're attracted to consistency wrapped in stability. Out of healing changes your taste, it changes your tolerance, it raises your standards, not just in others, but in yourself. And with that shift comes the return of people who are still operating at the level you left behind. They may be familiar, but they're not aligned. They may bring memories, but they don't bring growth. And this is where many people get stuck, because familiarity feels safe even when it's unhealthy. When someone returns, especially someone who knew how to speak to the unhealed version of you, it can stir something emotional. It can make you second guess your progress. It can make you wonder if maybe they've changed too. But just because they come back doesn't mean they've evolved. Sometimes they just miss the access. They miss the old dynamic, the one where you overextended and they underdelivered, where you gave too much and asked for too little, where your need for a connection outweighed your need for clarity. But that dynamic no longer fits, not because you're bitter, but because you're better. Better at listening to your gut, better at protecting your peace, better at identifying what's healthy and what's just familiar dysfunction. You attract back what no longer fits your healed self, because healing is like turning on a light in a room that's been dimmed for too long. And when that light comes on, everything becomes visible. You can see clearly what used to blend into the shadows. You can't unsee the red flags. You can't unknow what peace feels like. And now anything that threatens that peace feels like chaos in disguise. It doesn't matter how charming they are, how nostalgic the connection feels, or how much you once loved them. You can't return to a version of yourself that no longer exists. And even if you tried, you wouldn't fit there anymore. The healed version of you is too full of self-awareness, too grounded in truth, too familiar with joy that doesn't come with confusion. So when someone from your past returns, it's not a sign that you should go backward. It's a sign that you've moved forward. You've elevated, and elevation requires evaluation, not just of others, but of yourself. Because sometimes it's not about who comes back, but how you respond. Do you shrink to fit their comfort, or do you stand firm in your growth? Do you compromise to rekindle the past, or do you honor the woman you fought so hard to become? Your healing didn't happen by accident. It cost you something. Nights of wrestling with yourself, days of questioning your worth, moments where you almost went back because it was easier than sitting in the unknown. But you stayed. You stayed with yourself long enough to learn who you are without the noise, without the relationship, without the external validation. And now you have to protect that woman, not because she's fragile, but because she's finally whole. Wholeness changes what you entertain. It changes what you allow. It changes how long you stay where you're no longer growing. So when someone you've outgrown returns, it's not your job to convince them of who you've become. It's your job to discern whether they have the capacity to meet you where you are now. And if they don't, it's okay to let them go again, not in anger, not in bitterness, but in truth. The truth that your healed self deserves more than just familiarity. She deserves alignment. And sometimes alignment means saying no to what once felt like home, because home is no longer where your soul finds rest. Closure is one of those things people chase without realizing they already hold the power to give it to themselves. We wait on the call, the explanation, the apology, the moment when everything will finally make sense. We convince ourselves that healing can't happen until they admit what they did, until they explain why they did it, until they tell us what we meant to them. But the truth is, the longer you wait on someone else to bring you peace, the longer you delay your own freedom. Closure doesn't come wrapped in someone else's words. It comes from within, in the quiet, in the resolve, in the moment you decide you no longer need answers to move forward. There's a lie we often believe, and it sounds something like this: if I could just talk to them one more time, I'd finally understand. But how many times have you already had that conversation? How many ways did you rephrase your questions, hoping this time they'd respond with clarity instead of deflection? How many nights did you stay up rehearsing what you would say, what you would ask, what you would finally get off your chest? And how many times did you walk away from those conversations more confused, more disappointed, more lost than you were before? Because closure isn't about what they say, it's about what you accept. It's not about their truth. It's about your reality. You don't need someone to confirm the pain they caused in order to release it. You don't need their explanation to validate what you already felt. You lived through the confusion. You held yourself through the anxiety. You pieced together the silence into a narrative that gave you just enough peace to get out of bed in the morning. You survived what they didn't have the courage to address. That survival alone is enough evidence to decide that you're done seeking permission to let go. The moment you realize closure is a decision is the moment you take your power back. Because when you treat it like a conversation, you place your healing in someone else's hands. You say, I can't move forward unless you give me the words I want to hear. And when those words don't come, you stay stuck, not because you're weak, but because you're waiting. waiting on someone who may never be honest, waiting on someone who may never see your worth, waiting on someone who may not even be capable of giving you the truth you're hoping for. Closure that comes from them is always at risk. They can withhold it, they can twist it, they can use it to re-enter your life with just enough charm to confuse you again, but closure that comes from within can't be taken away. It doesn't waver. It's not dependent on their growth or their guilt. It comes from choosing to honor what you felt, even if they never acknowledge it. It's choosing to believe your intuition, even if they call you crazy. It's choosing to walk away, not because they told you to, but because you finally told yourself the truth. Sometimes the truth is simple but painful. They didn't love you the way you loved them. They weren't ready. They weren't honest. They weren't for you. And even if they had reasons, even if they had trauma, even if they had struggles you wanted to help them heal from, it doesn't change the outcome. Intentions don't erase impact, and understanding their pain doesn't mean you have to keep experiencing yours. And have compassion without inviting chaos. You can forgive someone and still decide they don't belong in your life. We think closure is a final chapter signed by both parties, but sometimes you're the only one signing the page. Sometimes you write the ending alone. And that doesn't make it any less valid. You don't need a shared conclusion to know the story is over. You don't need their blessing to walk away. Your healing doesn't require their cooperation. You can close the book quietly on your own and still be whole. People often come back when they sense they've lost access. And sometimes the temptation to re-engage is strongest right when you've made peace. They might return with kind words, apologies, or confusion disguised as curiosity. How have you been? I've been thinking about you. I miss what we had. But you'll know whether your closure was real based on your reaction. If their presence still stirs chaos in your spirit, if their words still make you question what you already healed from, you haven't made the decision yet. But when you can hear from them and still remain anchored, when you can smile and know it's truly over, that's when you know you've made peace with the silence. Closure isn't dramatic. It's not always emotional. Sometimes it's subtle. It's the moment you delete the messages, not out of anger, but because you no longer need to reread the past. It's when you stop checking their page, not because you're forcing yourself, but because it genuinely no longer interests you. It's when you stop explaining to others why it ended and start talking about what you've learned since it did. Closure looks like self-respect. It looks like new boundaries. It looks like joy that isn't tied to someone else's behavior. It's not loud, it's steady. And even if you never get the apology, even if they never admit what they did, even if they rewrite the story to make themselves the victim, you are still allowed to move on. You are still allowed to thrive. You are still allowed to build a life where their absence doesn't hurt anymore. Because healing doesn't wait for permission, growth doesn't wait for validation, and peace doesn't wait for closure to be mutual. Closure as a decision means you wake up one day and realize you're done asking for explanations that will never satisfy you. You're done analyzing words that were never meant to bring clarity. You're done making someone else the gatekeeper of your peace. You give yourself permission to be free, to be healed, to be whole, even without their participation. You are not broken because they never gave you the ending you hoped for. You are not unworthy because they couldn't see your value. You are not stuck because they walked away without warning. You are powerful because you decided not to wait. You chose yourself when they wouldn't. You created your own ending, and in that ending, you found your beginning.